Awesome.
We're live now.
Awesome. Fantastic. Welcome, welcome, welcome to it's the 5th Map Camp. I can't believe this is number 5. I mean, this started off with me going, I'm going to the pub. Anybody want to come along and do a little bit of mapping before it got completely out of hand. And we ended up, in town halls and theatres. And here we are now online. And this is our 5th Map Camp. So before we get started in all of this, of course, we better start with all the thank yous. Our first thank you, obviously, is to all our sponsors. So AWS, Agile Alliance, eSynergy, Endeavor, StreamSets. I mean, huge thank you to all of these companies for helping to make this happen. Also, a big thank you to all of you who are attending, because without you, we wouldn't be doing MapCamp. This year, particularly, a massive thank you to Jane Kingston and Steve Hudson, who organized all of this. They are the organizers behind MapCamp. They've created this environment for us. Just amazing. But, another huge thank you has to be to our speakers. We've got 36 speakers organized throughout the day, some amazing talk. And lastly, and certainly not least, because the most important people from my perspective, huge thank you to our chairs, Kat, Damien and Jen, for helping get all the speakers together, get all the subjects all organized and chairing throughout the whole day. And I've got to say, Kat, it's almost midnight with you, which is just like, wow. I mean, gosh, so thank you so much for doing all of this. So anyway, enough blah from me. What I'm going to do is I'm going to immediately throw it over to Kat, Damien and Jen. And could you give us a quick introduction? And also, I've got a question. What are you hoping to get out of MapCamp this year?
Okay, I guess I'll go first because I'm first in alphabetical order. I am Kat Swatell. I'm the chair of the society track this year, and I'm pumped about that. And I guess what I'm looking forward to is the same thing I look forward to every year at MapCamp. It's the weird connections that we make, basically. It's not a conference where everyone already knows each other. There's people coming from academia, there's people coming from industry, there's people coming from the government. And so I just look forward to what connections we can make across all the different places we come from and the different things that we think about and the ideas that we have. And I will pass it off to Damien.
Yeah, I'm absolutely the same for me. I'm absolutely honored to be here again. And given the year that we've had since we all gathered for MapCamp, for me, it's really interesting to be leading the resilience track because I think it has relevance for absolutely everybody, audience, speaker. Like Kat, I'm interested in some of the themes that emerge every year. You never know where they're going to come from, what they'll be. And I'm actually getting to introduce a few new speakers to MapCamp. So new ideas, new problems, new points of view. And I'm just interested to see how the audience, who is such a big part of MapCamp, sort of respond to this. So really looking forward to the question and answer sessions and some of the thoughts and provocations that come from that. Jen.
Thanks, Damien. Good morning, everyone. So I'm Jen Ashley, and I've been actually a part of MapCamp, co-chairing it initially with Simon, and I'm glad to be co-chairing it with Kat and Damien. Yes, I'm really looking forward to all the talks. We've been basically meeting up, at least the speakers, in my track, we've been meeting up for the past few months, basically, the talks are really going to be very interesting, and all the mapping exercises that they're going to do as well. I'm sure people are going to learn a lot from that, and I'm really looking forward to that, and the audience definitely will learn a lot from them today.
Awesome. I mean, it's for me also, this year's been fairly major in terms of mapping. Because very much what when I originally, most things I've done in mapping have been accidental. I mean, I created maps by accident when looking for something else. So I ended up creating an entire conference called MapCamp by pure accident by doing the sort of just a tweet. I now have a Spaces thing, which is a weekly sort of podcast on Twitter or whatever you call it. And that was me just finding a button on the mobile phone called Spaces and going, I wonder what that does. I mean, most things that I do are completely and utterly accidental, but it's delightful to see how the community itself has grown. And so we've got so much, we've got tools out there like online Wardley Maps. We've got certification programs with things like Ducati. We've got training programs with Pragmatic Wardley Mapping and Ben. We've got books, so many books coming out about mapping. It's just been marvelous. And it had, the big thing is it's not me. It's like, for example, MapCamp. I've got to say, I am so grateful to all three of you for the work that you've put in, the way it has been organized, the speakers we found. It's been just marvelous. And to some extent, I can sort of sit back into the background, except for right now, because Jane has twisted my arm and got me to prepare a talk. So I do know that you've got lots of stuff to prepare, because the main talks, the interesting talks, when I finish my blah, 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 kick off at 9 o'clock. So what I can do is I'll start my talk now, get it finished a little bit early to make sure that everybody's got time to get to the various tracks. And remember, we've got 3 tracks. We've got the square window, the archway, and the circle. Purely accidental is play school. Purely accidental. It's not my fascination with learning and everything else, and that I'm still a child. But we've got 3 tracks kicking off at 9 o'clock. And so I'm just going to say from me to all 3 of you, a big thank you for everything you've done. I must clap. Can I clap?
Thanks for the invitation.
Good. So any final words for attendees?
Yeah, check out the networking areas as well, aside from the talks. It's always good to connect with your fellow attendees as well as the other speakers.
Yeah, so in the on the VFair site, there is a networking area. You can also find the calendar, so you can add the talks into your calendar as well. Big reminder to everybody, code of conduct, please, as well. And also, just that people know, we are sponsoring charities this year as well. So we've got Cancer Research UK, Orangutan Outreach, and Parkinson's. So we're sponsoring 3 different charities. People often ask me, what about money and things like this. I mean, I don't make money from mapping at all. I mean, it's just something I love doing and I use in my research. I work for a company called DXC, but Jane and Steve have using MapCamp as an opportunity to raise funds for charities, which is fantastic. Kat, Damien, any final words you want to add, or?
Yeah, so for everybody new, there are some incredibly smart people already involved in MapCamp and some incredibly smart speakers. There is no such thing as a stupid question if it's asked early enough, and today is the best day to ask it. So feel free to get involved, ask questions, especially if the topic's getting away from you, because that happens to me all the time.
That is a fantastic point. I mean, one of the things mapping is all about is common language and challenging assumptions. Yes, being able to ask those questions in a safe environment. That's fantastic. Kat, sorry to put you on the spot, Kat. Any final last comments or words of wisdom that you might add at this point? Otherwise, let's get straight into it.
Well, I'm out of wisdom because it's 9 minutes after midnight here in Phoenix. But what I will say is just don't stress about missing sessions. Every single time slot is fantastic. Every single triad is fantastic. They're all recorded and you can go back and watch them later. Don't stress.
And that is such a fantastic point, because they are all recorded. They will be on this platform for the next 30 days. And then they're all going on to YouTube. And we're going to do a whole bunch of, what are they called? Slow watch parties. That's right. So we'll go through all of the talks all again. Slow watch parties. We're going to get that organized. And we can comment on them and everything else. So it's no longer Map Camp, it's Map Festival. No, I shouldn't say that. I will cause even more trouble. So at this point, I'm going to say I will let you go to get prepared and for your very long days. And thank you ever so much for doing this. And in the meantime, everybody else who wants to, I've got a little introduction into mapping.
Brilliant. Thanks, Simon.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Okay, so I've got to be very, very mindful of the time. So let me get my share screen up. View full screen mode. There we are. Now, I just want to double check. I can see several people talking in chat. Fantastic. Hopefully, one of you can see it says the state of mapping October 2021 Swardley. Can just somebody just in the chat say yes, they can see this. Looks fine. Fantastic. Isn't that wonderful? Oh, fantastic. Good. Right. So I'm just going to be mindful of the time. I know we've got to finish in 50 minutes. So the state of mapping. I'm Simon Wardley, by the way. I work for this company, DXC Technology. I research for them into all sorts of different areas. And one of the tools that I use in my research is mapping. Now, mapping is something that I started many, many years ago, long before I ever did anything like research, back when I was running companies. So it was 16 years ago. So what I want to go through is a quick introduction into mapping. What is a map? Because I know that some people are fairly new to this. I want to talk quickly about patterns, get into the subject of culture, and then talk a little bit about purpose, and then link it all back to what we're doing today. So quick introduction, mapping started here. This is an online photo service company called Fotango, a huge number of different lines of business, very profitable, revenue growing. It was really doing quite well, except for it had a problem. And that problem was this person, the CEO. The CEO was completely and utterly clueless, making it up as they went along. And I know this because I was the CEO. I used to come up with these wonderful statements, things like our strategy is customer focused. We will lead an innovative effort in the market through our use of agile techniques and open source. I just pinched them from other companies and just changed a few words, and that was it. I was just making it up. And so I was a little bit concerned that people would eventually rumble that I didn't know what I was doing. So I used to read every book I could find on strategy, and I was getting absolutely nowhere. Until I ended up in a bookshop in London. And in this particular bookshop, the booksellers asked me, had I ever read Sun Tzu's The Art of War? To which the answer was no. And so she persuaded me to buy 2 different versions, translations of the book. And I'm so grateful for that, because it was in the reading of the second translation that I noticed a pattern. So Sun Tzu talked about 5 factors that matter in competition. First, have a purpose and moral imperative. 2, understand your landscape, the environment you're competing in. 3, understand the climatic patterns, like the weather, how it's changing the landscape. Then understand doctrine, so principles of organization. And then you're into the leadership bit and the gameplay. And this overlapped with what the Mad Major, John Boyd, called the OODA loop. So you had the purpose. your game. Then you observe the environment. That's what landscape and climatic patterns are about. Then you orientate yourself around this with principles, doctrine. Doctrine is just a collection of principles. And then you decide where you're going to attack, and then you act, and that's where gameplay comes into it. And the more you do this, the better you get at this game. And at the heart of this are two whys: the why of purpose, I want to win this game or whatever it happens to be, and the why of movement. Why do I move this piece over that piece? I was quite excited by that. And it all depends upon you actually understanding the environment, understanding the landscape. And that is what got me into the idea of maps. So I started looking into military history. And one of my favorite battles is this one, Battle of Thermopylae. So Themistocles, ancient politician, Greek general, had a problem. Persians were invading, decides to block off the Straits of Artemisium, force the Persians along a coastal road into a narrow pass called Thermopylae, where a small number of troops could defend against a larger force. There are about 4,000 odd Greeks. The Greeks were independent city-states. And among those 4,000 Greeks were about 300 Spartans. And it was against 140, 170,000 Persians. And this, by the way, is obviously where we get the story of the 300 from. Because the point about narrow pass, you can use a small number of troops to defend against a larger force. Actually, you think that it's a constraint. So I was quite fascinated by how we use maps through military history to understand about battles. And obviously, once you start to learn these sorts of use maps, you see the impact that climate and weather has, you see the importance of principles and organizing, troops, and you learn different forms of gameplay, flank an opponent, whatever it happens to be. But I was looking at my company, and so I thought, well, here we are with a map. What am I using to decide what we're going to do and communicate with others? And I was using something called a SWOT diagram. So strengths, a well-trained Spartan army, high level of motivation not to become a Persian slave. I decided to create the SWOT of this battle. Weaknesses, the ethos might stop the Spartans turning up. A truckload of Persians are turning up. Opportunities, get rid of the Persians, get rid of the Spartans. We're Athenian, we hate the Spartans. Threats, the Persians get rid of us, and the oracle says a really dodgy film might be produced in a few thousand years. So I simply put these next to each other and said, what would you use to communicate and determine strategy in battle? Position and movement described by a map or some sort of framework like a SWOT. And it was obvious to me that you would use a map and position and movement. But what I was doing was I was using SWOTs. I was using SWOTs, I was using stories, I was using various forms of business models. And what I wasn't using was a map. And so that really struck me. And so I went around to the organization, told everybody, give me whatever maps you had. We had lots of maps in there. We had things like mind maps, and we had business process maps, and we had systems maps. And I took one of the systems maps, and this is one for the online photo service. And I took one component and I simply moved it. And I asked, how has the map changed? And the answer is, it hasn't. Well, that's a bit unusual, because if I take a geographic map and I take something like a map of the world and I shift Australia and put it next to, say, England, it definitely has changed. So why hasn't it changed here? And the answer is, it's not a map, it's a graph. To explain the difference, the three images at the top are all identical as graphs. So you've got Nottingham, London, Dover, Nottingham, London, Dover, Nottingham, London, Dover, connected by two roads, roughly M1, M2. And they are all identical graphs. The three images at the bottom are all completely different maps. Again, Nottingham, London, Dover, and two roads. The difference between a map and a graph is that in a map, space has meaning. So in a graph, it's all about the nodes and the connections. In a map, it's not just the nodes and connections, it's where it is on the map. So I thought, well, where does that space has meaning sort of come from? And it turns out that a map has three basic characteristics. One, well, the most simplest primitives. You have an anchor, like magnetic north. You have the position of pieces relative to each other. So this is north, south, east, or west of that. And you have consistency of movement. So if I'm going north, I'm going north. If I'm going south, I'm going south. So then I asked, could we map business? Well, I don't see why not. I didn't have a map of business. I just had graphs. So I thought, well, how do we map business? Where do we start? And I started with a cup of tea. I thought I'd map a tea shop because I drink tea and I sort of understood tea shops. Okay, what's my anchor going to be? Well, I decided to pick the business itself and the public. Now, there could be many different anchors I could choose. I could choose government regulators. I could break down the public into different consumer groups, but I thought I'd start there. Okay. Now, it's a tea shop, so they all have a need. The business has a need to sell cups of tea. We hope the public has a need to drink cups of tea. But a cup of tea has needs. It needs tea. It needs a cup. It needs hot water. It needs kettle. Hot water needs kettle and cold water. A kettle needs power. So what I've actually got is a chain of needs. So I start at the very top. I've got my anchor, in this case, public and business. And now what I've got is a partial ordered list, a chain of needs. So I've actually got anchor and position. And the further you get down the chain, the less visible something becomes, the more distant it is. So to a consumer, you're drinking your cup of tea, you don't really care too much about the power used to heat the kettle. I'm still missing something, movement. And the problem with movement is that in geographical terms, movement is pretty easy. Because what happens when we move from point A to point B, it's unlikely that point B itself will have moved, because during our journey time, it's unlikely that continents will have shifted, for example. If our journey took a long time, like 200 million years, then going from point A to point B would be slightly different, because the chances are that point B will have moved because the plates are moving. Unfortunately, in business, our plates of the economic system are moving quite rapidly. So, you can't simply go from A to B because the chances are B, will have moved. So you actually have to measure movement in terms of change itself. It took me about 6 months, 9,223 publications or something along those lines. But I eventually developed a pattern for doing this. And this is called the evolution axis. So what happens is when we look at our chain of components, they're all different forms of capital. And capital, it turns out, evolves through 4 common stages. You start with the genesis, then you get custom built examples and products, and then commodity and utility services. So now what we've got is a map. If I move any component on this, it changes the meaning of that map. Great. So what? Well, one of the beauties about maps is that they're all imperfect representations of a space. The perfect map of France would have to be 1-to-1 scale, which means it would be the size of France, and therefore it would have to be France itself. And as a map, that's pretty useless. So all maps are imperfect representations of a space. But that's good, because that allows us or gives us permission to challenge. So we might look at a map and go, well, you're missing a component. I can see your assumptions, but you're missing staff. And somebody might say, oh, staff, that's more commodity these days, robots. Okay, if you really feel that way. Somebody else might challenge what we're doing. Somebody might say, why are we custom building kettles? Why aren't we using standard kettles? Somebody might say, oh, it's brand exclusivity. That gives us a unique feature. The point about this, it provides a common language. Doesn't matter whether you're from marketing or from finance or engineering or biz dev, we can all talk about the same environment using a map. So I'll give an example of this, very simple one, insurance company. This is the process flow for this particular insurance company, how they used to get compute. They had a problem. They were rapidly growing. They were getting more and more servers into their data centers. This is quite old, this example. It was creating a bottleneck. And so they'd come up with this plan of buying robotics to get rid of the bottleneck. automate the whole process. And they'd spent 6 months working on this. They had vendors in, or they'd done all their selection, built their business case, etc. And so compute, order server, server goods in, modify, mount, rack, that's where the bottleneck was. And they asked me, what did I think? And the problem is I can't go and ask them, why are you spending, many millions on robots? Because they've spent 6 months working on this. And they'd already created their own story, their own narrative. And the problem you find in business is that we often run things with stories. And all stories are political, as in they have a storyteller. And we tell everybody to be a great leader, you've got to be a great storyteller. So when you go and challenge somebody's story, you're actually challenging them as a person, as being a great leader. So I can't go in and saying why you're doing robotics, because I'm challenging them, and they'll just get very defensive. So I said, well, can we map it? And there was a lot of argument about this, more argument actually than there was time taken to map, because it only took them about 10 to 15 minutes to map the environment. And so they came up with a map. User needs compute, order server, server goods in, rack, mount, modify. Now, I can challenge the map without challenging the person. So I'm not saying their story is wrong. I'm just now questioning the map. So they went compute as a product. I might disagree. Order server, server goods in, they thought were all more commodity. They went rack and custom built. I thought, why have you got rack and custom built? And they said we had custom built racks. So what are the modifications you're doing to service? Well, the service we buy don't fit our racks. So we have to take cases off, drill new holes, add new plates in order to get them to fit our racks. And that's why you need robotics, yeah. And of course, in that room, somebody just immediately went, why aren't we using standard racks? Now, this is probably one of, if not the most common problem I see in business. People optimizing process flow without thinking about evolutionary flow. So they optimize existing processes rather than thinking about how things are evolved. And it's not because people are daft or stupid, it's because people can't see the environment. Lots of examples of this. This is a good friend of mine, Liam Maxwell. We used to do a lot of stuff with the UK government. I mean, one particular project alone saved about, just simply mapping it out, saved 425 million. I mean, the insurance company example is only a few million. And again, I have to emphasize, it's not because people are daft. It's literally they're trapped by context, trapped by stories, and they just can't see their environment. One of my, more modern, up-to-date version. This is one of my favorite ones recently. And there's been a map of the industry on my whiteboard for about 3 years. I used it to identify obstacles and plan investment to create this $100 million project. Mapping was instrumental in developing the narratives that persuaded all the parties to come together. That is the map. The reason why I like this particular map, this project, if you haven't worked out already, is this one. It's the greenhouse gas monitoring. So it's up there in space. That was a consortium of different companies coming together to build this particular satellite system. So I love the fact that maps were used in doing this. One of my other favorite examples, of course, is HS2, high-speed rail. So James Findlay, a good friend, used to be the CIO for HS2, now does all sorts of interesting work with the Royal Navy and RNLI and others. Back in, 2011, 2012, roughly, we needed to, he needed to build HS2 in a virtual world. And the reason for this, very simply, is it's cheaper to dig up a virtual world and we go, whoops, we got that wrong, than it is to dig up the English countryside. And so they started off with a systems diagram. So this is a graph of the system. This is what they need to build. And the question then came in, how do we build it? Where do we use, what techniques do we use? Off the shelf, agile, Six Sigma. There's about 387 million possible permutations of that question with that particular graph. And so normally in government, what we tended to do was just outsource the whole lot and break it into sort of, sensible sounding structures, things like, that's engineering, So we'll put that in engineering. That sounds a bit like user experience. We'll put that in user experience, etc. And these projects tend to fail, cost overruns, all that sort of stuff. So what James did was he quickly mapped it out, sent me the map. This was the map, 2012, and asked me, how do you organize this? Now, I'd been mapping by that point for good 6-7 years. And so I'd come across this problem several times. And relatively easy, because as things evolve, their characteristics change. So in the Genesis, it's all about, a change. And so what you want to use is methods which reduce the cost of change. So extreme programming, very, very good there. When it becomes more commodity, so industrialized, you're about reducing deviation. So Six Sigma or outsourcing to a utility provider is good there. In the middle, we're all about learning. So using things like Scrum, MVP, all that sort of, that stuff we call lean, where we're all about learning and reducing waste. That works well there. So simply apply that pattern across your map. Stuff on the left, build out in-house, off-the-shelf products on the right-hand side, outsourced utility providers. And so that's what they did back in 2012. The project ended up in front of the Public Accounts Committee, being praised for being massively under budget and ahead of schedule. Normally, again, as we said, we would have just broken it into chunks and outsourced them, and invariably hit cost overruns because we'd used the wrong method in the wrong place. So one of the things I also like about maps is, and the way I tend to use them, is what we call pre-mortem, post-mortem. So pre-mortem challenge, like the insurance company, we'll sit there, we'll map it out, and we'll say, why are we doing this? Then we'll create a map, and then we'll go and do something, and then we'll do post-mortem learning using the same map. And it's through that pattern that I learn patterns. So there are 3 basic types of patterns with map. The first is climatic patterns. These are the almost the rules of the game. They are almost like the weather. So if I take any chain, use application, best coding practice, runtime, all the way down to compute, the first pattern you learn is everything evolves. Supply and demand competition, it will evolve. Then you learn, and the past success builds inertia. So we become very successful in the past. And so, for example, best architectural practice with building compute, we're really good at this as compute as a product. So things like N+1, disaster recovery tests, building data centers. So we've got huge resistance to evolving to something like a utility or cloud. Because it evolves, you get a change of practice. And that's because you get a change of characteristics. So you get what's called co-evolution. So best architectural practice for compute as a product, it evolves to a utility, we get a new emerging practice, which eventually we call DevOps. The efficiency enables innovation. So as things evolve, they enable us to build higher order systems. So get standard bricks, we can build more complex, complicated buildings. And of course, those higher order systems create new sources of value and worth. Those are just some very, very basic patterns. There's about 30 of them, which you can use on a map to anticipate change. And that sort of stuff is useful for things like M&As, seeing where markets are going, gameplay, working out where to invest. So in Ubuntu, I used to run strategy for a company called Canonical, which provides something called Ubuntu. We used a map to map out the space, how it was changing the industry. This was about 2008, 2009, and use this to attack the map. And, the effect was this. We spent $500,000. It took us 18 months. We were 2-3% of the operating system against Red Hat and Microsoft. We took 70% of all cloud. Because simply we could see the map. We could see it was all going to a cloud. This was 2008. We could see the emerging practice. We could see the new applications being built. We knew where to focus. Pretty straightforward. Right, the next set of patterns are called doctrines. So these are universally useful patterns for organization. There's about 40 of them. Things like this, focus on user needs, understand the details, understand the supply chain, the components involved, understand what is being considered. It's not good enough to know you've got a kettle. I mean, you've got to know what type of kettle. Is it a custom built one? Is it, or should kettles be more of a commodity? Then challenge assumptions. Why are we custom building kettles if it's a commodity? There's about 40 of those. And then we get into the leadership bit, and there's about 100 different forms of gameplay in there. And there's a wonderful book called Reaching Cloud Velocity, Jonathan Allen and Thomas Blunt, from AWS. I think it was AWS's second ever book. You'll find about 17 pages of mapping in there, including some gameplay. There's a particular model called Innovate, Leverage, Commoditize, which is within that book. And you can use that to tear up industry after industry. It's great fun. But I'm not going to go through gameplays because there's like 100 of those. And so I just want to just tell you that there are different patterns you can learn. At this point, people will often say to me, oh, this is just too complicated. We just need the right culture. Okay. So there's a problem here. If I look at a map, this is a map of HS2 in terms of building it in a virtual world. What we've got is a principle, use appropriate methods. So it's saying, there's no such thing as one size fits all. You can't use Agile everywhere or Six Sigma everywhere. You've got to use multiple methods. But there are also two beliefs. On the right-hand side, you've got a belief in process over people. On the left-hand side, you've got a belief in people over process. Now, those are opposite beliefs, but they can happily coexist in the same system as long as we understand context. Now, of course, once we start talking about values and beliefs, then we're into culture. Now, one of my favorite anthropologists was Kroeber. Kroeber basically said that despite, this was 50 years ago, it hasn't changed much, despite a century of efforts to define culture adequately, there is no agreement among anthropologists regarding its nature. So anthropologists are the experts on culture, and they can't agree on what culture actually is. And so I love it when business folk come and tell me, well, it's all about culture, because you can just say, well, what do you mean by culture? And before you know it, you can get into all sorts of wonderful debates. And I think the problem was highlighted by another anthropologist, a favorite of mine, Margaret Mead, who pointed out that language is a discipline of cultural behavior. So language is part of culture. And because of that, that means you won't be able to describe culture in language. And that's Gödel's incompleteness theorem. So no model can be complete and true within itself. So this led me to ask the question, could we map culture? Well, if I look at a map, you've got Genesis, custom, product, commodity at the bottom. That's really just different stages of evolution, stage 1, 2, 3, and 4. And those are just labels for activities, but we have other labels which we use, which have exactly the same characteristics for different forms of capital. So we have practice, data, knowledge. We just have different labels for each of those different stages. So I can mix and match. I can go concept, emerging, converging, accepted. That's perfectly fine. So I can put those at the bottom, concept, emerging, converging, accepted, and I could start to map something else. In this case, I started to map out ethical values within a collective. So, universal basic income was an emerging value. A paid holiday, converging on agreement, unionization, pretty much accepted. But those ideas and those concepts didn't appear just on their own. They were based upon things. So in this case, workers' rights and civil rights, or what Martin Luther King called the twin pillars of democracy. And of course, those things didn't just appear. They were based on something else. Workers' rights came from the Knights of Labour movement. And so it's all connected back with abolition. And of course, all of this stuff has the same climatic patterns. It evolves. So what we can do is we can start mapping out ethical values within a system. Now, if I just take the top of this and compress it down. So this is what we call a pipeline. So if I just get back, what I've done is just taken the most visible values that we often see and just put it into a pipeline format. So we just say there's a thing called values. We sort of got convergent agreement on what values are. All of these components are evolving. Okay. That's a starting point, but where do I go from here? Well, to explore this, I got a bunch of people together who just couldn't agree on anything. I got a group of Brexiteers and a group of Remainers, and these people would just would argue. It was all story based, etc. Nobody was going to see the other person's opinion. And I got them to sit in a room, talk about this culture issue using a map. And by using the map, it was the same a bit like I'm not challenging your story. We're talking about the assumptions of the map. We're saying this map is wrong. That's how we created this. And this is basically a map, a very imperfect map of culture itself. So there's many different concepts in there: sense of belonging, safety, behavior, values, doctrine, memory, gameplay, competition with others. But that's all part of it. And of course, when it comes to culture, we're not singular. We don't belong to one collective. We belong to many. And for example, family, nation state, maybe a football club, or maybe a church or something. Your company, you belong to many. And you can't just copy values. You can't just say, well, if we copy the values and beliefs of this company to this company, will be identically the same. Well, you won't be, because you've got all these other components involved, which are all linked together. You can do things like you can adopt, values. You can adopt, say, or doctrine, for example, and just be mindful of the landscape. So you can take principles from one company and apply them to yours. It won't make your culture the same because there's all these other components, but you can adopt at least. And there are feedback loops. So our collective, depending upon how successful we are at spreading values, that influences our behavior and our sense of safety and our sense of belonging to the collective. Of course, these can be negative as well. So if we're not very successful, we start going back the other way. So what? Well, you can manipulate. Once you start mapping out spaces, a bit like gameplay, then you can start to manipulate these sorts of spaces. And so one of the ones that interests me is, we often talk about power with. So we often talk about power, social structures, and power with others. And I like power with, we as a collective want control over an environment. But there are different forms of doing this, cooperatives, communism, whatever it happens to be, with different levels of success in terms of spreading their values. There's also power over. This is all about the individuality, so not power with others. There's power over others. So it's all about my agency. Of course, that requires a collective to have power over. And of course, there's different ways of doing this, dictatorship or, market system based upon exclusion, whatever it happens to be. And they have different levels of success in spreading their values. And of course, then there's power to, which is where I have power over and I give that power to somebody else, so power to, and, that's the act of sharing. So that depends upon the values, again, within the system. I like this stuff because all of this stuff is connected, in this case, to values. And so if you alter values, you can change the balance of different types of power. Or at least that's the idea and what people are experimenting with, and certainly have been experimenting with for a long, long time. Because you change the values through things like art. In the past, maybe been statues and paintings, and then it eventually became things like Hollywood and things like the Avengers movie. That's probably the most valuable art there is out there. These days, though, that art is now in terms of video games, interactive, immersive experience, where again, organizations, groups are trying to subtly alter people's values through the playing of video games. So this is a particular one from Hezbollah. I like this one, Project Violencia, trying to change behaviors in a more positive light. So why does that matter? Well, it sort of matters because when we think about nation states, we're all in some sort of competition, I suppose, with each other. And in a physical world, we think of it in terms of here we are as a nation, here's our border, sensitive subject with Brexit, obviously, but here's our collective, our behaviors, our values within this border. And sometimes we have conflict with others, hopefully we don't. There are many ways of changing the game. One is to change the values of the people within that collective. If you change them all to be like you, well, they are you. And we do exactly the same, but not in physical spaces, in economic and digital spaces. We should have, here's the economic system, this is our border, this is where our collective, our behaviors, our values, except for we don't, because we don't map it. So we don't have any maps, so we can't see where the borders are. I mean, we're terrible. I mean, as we're discovering, we barely understand our supply chains, let alone map it. But if you start getting into mapping, you start to realize that as a collective, and this has been going on, you can embed values through things like simulation models into AI systems. So this is the whole Beijing versus China. And by values, I mean, it's something as simple as the trolley problem. So you pick any vehicle, were to pick a self-driving car, a car comes along, you can kill five people or one. Who do you kill? Well, it depends very much on the values of your society. So if you value, individualism, money, and the one person is extremely wealthy, it's tough luck for the five people. If you value, collectivism or Confucian ideals, then it's tough luck for the one person. So our values will be embedded in the simulation models, which are embedded in the AI systems. And of course, we've got this game going on. I won't bore you with that. Just tell you China won that. So I think even the Pentagon now pretty much agrees that the UK's just announced its national AI strategy. That's a bit like Oracle turning up to the cloud, 7 years after the battle's already been fought. But there we are. So I often get asked, is mapping just about conflict, therefore? Well, no, it's about competition. And competition is about seeking something together. So it's about seeking a resource, seeking knowledge of something. And there are many different ways of doing that. One, it may be conflicts, so fighting together. One may be cooperation, working together. One's collaboration, laboring together. And these are all different plays in that space of competition. And which one you use will a lot of the time depend upon what your purpose is. So to explain that, this is a quite old map. This is my map of mapping itself. So one of the first things I did with mapping was actually to map it. And I use this map of mapping, have used it to sort of manage where I'm taking mapping itself. Now, we start off with the purpose, it's got scope, it's got various components like doctrine, climactic patterns, but there's a conflict. The conflict is here, my imperative. My imperative is to rebel against consultants that enslave us. I've never been very happy with the big consultancy firms. Been the same for the last 15, 16 years. I mean, I keep on reading, the many times McKinsey has been embroiled in scandals, all these sorts of stories. Not a fan. And so what I tried to do was, what I was hoping to do with mapping was to give people the tools to actually understand their environment. It's what Kat called the epistemic justice league. It was, it's all about giving people really that freedom to understand the environment, learn patterns from each other, and not have to rely on some sort of ivory tower, some sort of magical, arcane words, which is how I see most of the consultancy industry. So I decided to use collaboration, cooperation with others to tackle this conflict. So this is why you think things like learn mapping, the doctrine, the climactic patterns, this all open. It's basically me marshalling others who have the same problem to fight against or to rebel against the large management consultancies which tend to enslave our corporations. And gosh, I started this journey 15 years ago, and it's just been incredible. I mean, we've got so many good things out there. Tools, for example. I absolutely love online Wardley Maps. It's not the only tool. There's several others, and people are starting to build repositories of maps and everything else. This stuff is fantastic. Books. I mentioned the AWS book. We've got Flow Architectures by James Urquhart. We've got building software platforms. That's coming at the moment. There are lots of books being produced now on mapping, which is great to see. I love the training. Ben does his pragmatic Wardley mapping, not the other one, not the only person who does mapping courses. There are several others. But one of the things I particularly like about this is I know you will uncover opportunities worth 100 times the course price. In fact, I guarantee it, or I'll give you your money back. I love this within the mapping community. Come and do the training. If you don't make 100 times the value of the cost of the course, we'll just give you your money back. I mean, I can't imagine a big consultancy firm ever coming to me and saying, we'll build that government project for 2 million. And if you haven't made 200 million in government, we'll just give you your 2 million back. It just wouldn't happen. I love this sort of attitude. The focus on value, the focus on user need. We're also starting to get, practitioners, certification exams with the entire field is being fleshed out more with groups like Ducati, which is education charity. I mean, this is really exciting stuff. We've had a lot of talk about recently about creating a mapping foundation. So I've spent some time with Steve Perkis, that's Steve's Twitter handle, Perkis, talking about what we needed to create a foundation. The values that we need to have, what the purpose would be, supporting the community, what it would need to provide, what it actually would cost to do this properly. And so we went through this process and we haven't created it yet because there's sort of a realization is, well, does the community really want this? Okay, well, let's put up the funds, what it will require, and just ask people to contribute. So we reckon it will cost about 100,000 to get this off the ground. If people, there is now a GoFundMe page, and if we get to the 100,000, then Steve will build this thing, and if we don't, we won't. But what we'll do is next year we'll ask the same question, and so at some point in the future, there'll be enough companies, enough people with enough interest that will actually make it happen. And lastly, there's things like MapCamp, these events. MapCamp isn't the only event, and a huge thank you for Stephen and Jane for putting this all on, but this is where we all sort of come together. So I've given you an introduction to sort of where mapping started and the idea of a map. I've talked a bit about patterns. I've talked a bit about culture, and then I've talked a little bit about my purpose, where I was taking mapping, what I wanted to do. But there's something else. We've got a climate catastrophe heading towards us. And we're not going to mitigate the effects of this with, I love Greta Thunberg's blah, 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 with just stories. We're not going to mitigate the effects if we just have poor communication and conflict. We're not going to mitigate the effects unless we start getting a handle on our supply chains. And we're not going to mitigate the effects unless we start really understanding the values we have in society and how we change those values. So all of these components are hidden away, in MapCamp. There's 3 windows. The first window is all about resilience. The second window is about that idea of sustainability and understanding components in the supply chain. And the third window is all about society itself and understanding things like our values. And those, for me, are 3 critical components if we want to help mitigate some of what's heading towards us. So I've done enough blah, blah, blah myself. I'm going to say, have a wonderful day. There are some truly amazing speakers and really interesting talks during the day. I mean, it's really good stuff. I'll be hanging around in chat, so you're welcome to always come and talk to me. All I will say is thank you. Enjoy yourself. Have a lot of fun. And hopefully I'll see you at the fireside chat at the very, very end of the day. Thank you. At this point, I will close everything down. Do I close everything down? VFairs, are you still with me?